today to the news that 12,000 may be losing their jobs. I assume the same problem is affecting the entire airline business right across the world. What are other airlines doing?
We are going to see this as a wave, Piers, and sadly, British Airways' announcement is probably just one of the first major airlines to announce something so drastic. And that is because the airline is having to envisage itself as in a future that is going to be a very different place. The air travel world is not going to be the same. And as a result, airlines are going to have to be making these tough decisions. But the only way that airlines are going to be able to survive is either by taking these very difficult decisions or with government intervention. And for the majority of airlines worldwide, they are waiting for that government intervention. Over in Europe, in France and the Netherlands, the Dutch and French government have already pledged 11 billion euros to Air France and KLM to ensure that that airline, or those two airlines, have a future. Lufthansa, the national airline of Germany, they are in talks for 9 billion euros as part of the rescue. In the UK, the government isn't per se dealing with airlines as a whole, but on a case-by-case basis. And with British Airways' parent company making quite a healthy profit last year, they are expecting BA to first exercise their own resources and make their own decisions before approaching the government for any help.
Well, the 12,000... Yeah, Alex, that's a really interesting point, because we think, of course, of British Airways as our national airline. We have, you know, a great connection to it. But to what extent is it a UK company?
Exactly. This is an Anglo-Spanish company. It is part of a wider group, the IAG group, that includes the national carrier of Ireland, 3 Spanish airlines. So it is part of that larger group. But this is British Airways. This is the national flag carrier. And of course, it's very sad to see that actually these are the measures they'll have to be taking. I sat down with the CEO of BA in late January, where he said that the fear with COVID-19 was that he may have to reduce Chinese flights and the access to the China market. And here we are 4 months later, in an unprecedented crisis. This is the largest crisis in the history of flight itself, not just of the airlines. And so this is why they're in this very difficult decision.
Yeah, how many people are flying at the moment?
The majority of passengers arriving back to the UK are arriving on repatriation flights, but the likelihood is, we know Matt Hancock said around 10 days ago, there are 15,000 passengers arriving into the UK. That figure is probably somewhere now between 6,000 to 10,000 passengers still walking into the UK with no checks, no measures, no quarantine, no requirement to self-isolate. We spoke a few days ago here on Good Morning Britain about how the government were, quote, considering that they may introduce these measures. But it's questionable as to why they haven't just stated, for those passengers arriving right now, you should be self-isolating, given many could be returning from destinations that have been ravaged by coronavirus. They are still holding their heels. They are still waiting on any announcement regarding the change to airport measures, leaving the country as an outlier compared to 90% of countries where the world's population are living in.
Yeah, absolutely staggering. And just to remind people, the policy was telling people to self-isolate very early on in this crisis. Correct. And then they stopped it. They actively stopped telling people to self-isolate when you come into this country from corona-ravaged countries. I mean, it made no sense to me. Anyway, Simon, Alex, what an extraordinary time for you guys. You know, people in the travel and aviation expertise business commenting now on a business that is barely existing. And thank you for all the work you're doing on this. And I, sadly, will be talking to you again quite regularly, I would think, as this unfurls.
Thanks very much indeed.